Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club and to the City Club Forum. I am Nelson Weiss, President of the City Club. Today our speaker is Jean I. Maeroff, education writer for the New York Times. An old friend of Cleveland, Mr. Maeroff was a writer on education for the Plain Dealer before going to New York more than a decade ago. He's an old friend to many of us as well who live in the community now and lived in the community years back. An old friend of mine when I was on the school board in Cleveland Heights, and it's a pleasure to have him back here with us. For anyone whose interest lies in the area of public education, Jean Maeroff's name is high on the list of experts in the field. Mr. Maeroff is the author of several books, including The Guide to Suburban Public Schools, published in 1976, and his latest book, Don't Blame the Kids, published in 1981, which has just come out in paperback. He's contributed to a number of anthologies and written articles for many magazines, including the New York Times Magazine, Saturday Review, New York Magazine, Parents, 17, Ladies' Home Journal, and others. He's received awards from the Education Writers Association, the International Reading Association, and the American Association of University Professors. He serves on a variety of boards, including the advisory board of the Institute for Educational Management of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Mr. Maeroff is a graduate of Ohio University, received a master's degree from Boston University. He will speak to us today on the subject, Public Education, Where is it going? Jean?
It's a special treat to be speaking in Cleveland, and especially in this forum. Thomas Wolfe was probably right, and people can't go home. We change, others change, places change. One thing that seems not to change is the weather in Cleveland. And it's mid-October, and I noticed that the leaden skies are setting in for the long stay, and the siege is beginning with the icy fingers of winter reaching out. So that's all very familiar. Down in Washington, there's a former broadcasting executive, now hanging out in the United States Senate, who thinks that public prayer would be a very good idea. Never mind that the New Testament says that it's an activity best left to the privacy of one's closet. This fellow by the name of Jesse Helms would like to have the government encourage public prayer. Interestingly enough, he's of a political persuasion that holds that the government has interfered too much in people's personal affairs. How one could hold to this position and still want the government poking its eagle's nose into matters of religion eludes me. In any event, the senator from North Carolina is not asking for an amendment to encourage prayer on the job or on buses and airplanes or in football stadiums or even in amusement arcades where people who play Pac-Man can use all the help they can get. No, he wants the government to be looking after prayer in the public schools. Those are the places where those godless little heathens gather and read atheistic words like "watch Spot run." For now, the Senate, after a controversial filibuster, has decided to put Mr. Helms' proposed amendment on the shelf. Make no mistake, it's not dead. Also very much alive is a proposal that made its way to Capitol Hill from the Oval Office down on Pennsylvania Avenue. Ronald Reagan thinks it might be a good idea if the public treasury were used to help defray the costs of tuition for families that choose to send their children to non-public schools. This kind of recommendation coming from Mr. Reagan shows about as much friendship for public education as the Japanese fishing industry has shown for whales. Public education, in fact, is sorely in need of friends. These have been years in which public education has been besieged from all sides. The schoolhouse is crumbling, and the only people who seem to be running to the scene are throwing bricks in the windows. It could be worse. After all, no high-ranking executive of the government in this country has been heard as the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was heard in Iran asking little children to spy on their teachers to see if they're engaging in deviant thinking. Yet even without explicit reports of deviant thinking, 46% of the parents with children in the public schools confessed in the most recent Gallup poll that if they had the wherewithal, they would choose to send their children to non-public schools. This disaffection comes at a time when the ranks of those who would like to censor what is taught in the public schools is growing. The Phi Delta Kappan, which is a very distinguished educational journal, tells us in its most recent issue that America's public schools are the target of an attack by the new right that has placed the very existence of public education in jeopardy. I find this charge a bit hyperbolic, but there is something going on that's worrisome. Creationists and a whole host of other right-minded thinkers have planted enough fears in authors and in publishers that textbooks are being modified in response to their objections. I happened to see that firsthand when I was looking at the textbook adoption hearings in Texas, and the publishers confessed that they were making changes to try to sell the books. To be sure, the public schools have enough intrinsic difficulties without having to contend with the slings and arrows of outrageous detractors. Actually, it's not all that new for special interest groups to seek to get the public schools to do their bidding. At the turn of the century, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was very active in trying to get the schools to teach about the evils of alcoholism, whether or not the presentation was fair or not. I guess that the criterion of acceptance is whether or not one approves of the particular special interest involved. The public schools are used to teach students now about their ethnic heritage, about drug abuse, about how to drive a car, and about the free enterprise system. People interested in good health have been able to persuade the schools to require children to have inoculations. Last year, the New York City school system barred more than 100,000 children from school because they did not have inoculations against a whole range of childhood diseases. Few would dispute the wisdom and the need of inoculation in children. But why can't the parents of the children be required to carry out their responsibilities? Why was it necessary to subpoena principals who were so law-breaking as to let those children into their schools? Why wasn't anybody handing out subpoenas to the parents? Society is adept at loading down the public schools with all sorts of burdens that parents and other agencies either fail to carry out, don't want, or give up. I think racial desegregation is another example of this, a very highly desirable goal. But it's the schools, not the workplace, not the places of residence that become the focus of efforts to desegregate. When Congress had the chance, it refused even to put enforcement powers into the Federal Housing Act. All of the attendant controversy that surrounds us then descends upon the schools. And it's not even done in an equitable manner. Those with the money and the desire to escape simply move across school district lines. And I think you could look all over Cuyahoga County to see where that situation exists. Leaving the big city school systems, the Clevelands, the Detroits, the St. Louises, to have to carry out a mandate. If racial desegregation is the law, and if it's a desirable goal for society, then why is it not desirable for the suburbs? After all, God did not draw the school district lines. Sex education is another example. Children need it, but parents don't provide it. So the schools get shoved into the breach. And again, they get criticized for performing a public service that nobody else is willing to handle. Where can we turn for this? To the educational researchers? Do they have something to say about that? Judging by some of the most recent findings coming out of educational research, I don't think they have too much to offer. Just recently, the Educational Testing Service came up with some very profound findings, which probably cost a lot of money. What they discovered in this extraordinary research was that, quote, children have naturally different approaches to learning to read, unquote. This was a revelation. And they also discovered in this same study that, quote, children can learn from their mistakes, unquote. And this is what educational research has to offer. I suppose that we might be better off spending that money on something else. The next thing you know, the researchers will be telling us that students who study French learn it better than students who don't study French. And that's kind of the direction that educational research seems to take in helping to solve some of these problems. Getting back to the Gallup poll, it's clear that law and order are very big items in the public consciousness. Many of us can recall a presidential campaign that was run not that many years ago on the law and order theme. The alleged lack of discipline rankles the public more than any other shortcomings of the schools. Year after year, they tell the Gallup poll takers that this is their #1 concern. And it's true that entering the lavatories at some schools is more dangerous than taking a walk through Central Park after midnight. In some schools, you know now, the lavatories are kept locked, and the only way a student can go to the lavatory is go and ask somebody who works in the school to accompany him or her, and then the door is unlocked, and that person stands guard until the student comes out, and then the door is locked again. In New York City, all doors to the schools are locked except for one, and that one has a guard at it. Exasperation with the public schools has reached such proportions that educating children at home on the dining room table is now regarded as a serious alternative by some people. Not very many, but some. Actually, experts estimate that about 10,000 families follow this course. And though the malady may be short of epidemic proportions, this doesn't mean that the advocates of public education should overlook the symptoms. Public education is sick if only a few thousand people pull their children out of school because they think it's safer and that they'll get a better education doing it at home. The small Christian schools popping up all around the country like dandelions in a spring lawn are another unfortunate sign. Here is another significant group of people at odds with the public schools. So strongly do they feel about their cause that they're willing to break the laws. These are law and order people who consider themselves sometimes beyond the reach of the law. In Louisville, Kentucky, such a group vowed to keep open their school at the very time authorities were telling them that what they were doing was illegal, because they had not conformed with the state regulations for running a school. Faith Christian School met in a church basement, and the minister who ran the school refused to hire state-certified teachers. It's an interesting lesson in law and order that he was teaching his pupils. Who's in charge? Who's calling the signals when this happens? Is it the people, or is it the minister and other people like him of Faith Christian Church? I think that those who are primarily making the decisions in public education, and when it fails and when it succeeds, they're the ones who are responsible, are the local school boards and the administrators that they hire. And I think that they have to take a lot of the responsibility. I wrote a whole book called Don't Blame the Kids, and I tried to give out this blame and responsibility to a lot of groups because I think there's too much dumping on the students themselves. But the school boards and the administrators they hire can really make the difference if they try. I know all about the demands that the federal government and the state government and what they've been asking the schools to do, and the courts, a court in Boston, the federal district court there, in effect has had primary power over the public schools since 1974. But in the final analysis, the local school boards hold the trump cards. They decide on the reading programs. They have much to do with who gets chosen to be the principals. They determine which teachers are kept and tenured. They set the level of expectation in the school district. They decide how many sections of physics will be offered in the high schools. They set the priorities so that they either emphasize or do not emphasize education in the primary grades. It doesn't take a seer rubbing a crystal ball to find out what the public wants. Just last month in Arlington, Virginia, dozens of parents waited overnight to be able to sign up their children the next day for a traditional style school operated by the Fairfax County Public School System. And what they were waiting to sign them up for was kindergarten in 1984, so they could get them into that school. What's the message? Not that public schools have to convert every school building to an old-fashioned traditional approach. That's not it. But that public school systems have to do more to give people choices, starting with meaningful magnet schools and going beyond that. People have to have a chance to choose and should not be compelled to use a particular school just because it happens to be in their neighborhood. In Community School District 4, which serves the Spanish Harlem area of Manhattan, they have now abolished all zoning for junior high schools. And parents there can choose from any of the junior high schools in that district. Nobody has to go to any school because they live in a certain place. And the schools are in a fierce competition. It's bringing out the best in them, and this is a place with a largely Hispanic and black enrollment in which scores are rising very quickly, and in which, believe it or not, white people from other parts of the city are sending in their children because they want those schools. It's time for more alternatives in public education. And running around denouncing tuition tax credits is not enough. The public should be given, in the public sector, the kinds of choices that they would seek if they had tuition tax credits. And if the public school systems don't do more to exercise their monopoly to the benefit of the public, they will no longer enjoy that monopoly. Just as sure as Ronald Reagan was elected president, they will lose it. People who don't have a stake in the public schools are growing as an element in society. Enrollments are shrinking because of the lower birth rate. The elderly proportion of the population is growing. More people have children later or not at all. Add up all of these trends, and what you see is that the percentage of the public that has any stake in the public schools is shrinking. And something has to be done by the public schools to reach out and have those people have some confidence in them. Quality education has to be linked to these efforts. If you don't think there's a problem here, take a look at the scores on the SAT tests or the ACT of people who are going to become teachers. They're just about the lowest of those who are heading into any profession. All in all, something has to happen to the quality of teaching if people want to or are to regain confidence in public education. People want to know why they're spending some $100 billion on an enterprise in this country that still turns out defective products. Young people who are either unequipped for the job market or not ready to go to college. And I'm not talking about all parts of the product, but too many of them. The greatest crisis is clearly in the area of science and mathematics. Who's going to be teaching those subjects in the future? Scott Thompson, the executive director of the National Association of Secondary School Principals, in recent testimony to Congress, said there's been a 77% decline in the number of secondary school math teachers being produced in the last decade, and a 65% decline in 77% was in math and 65% in science. And it's not hard to see why. If somebody majors in math, they can go into industry, they can go into the computer world at salaries far exceeding what they'll earn after a career in teaching. It's not a problem easily overcome. It calls for creative solutions, and local school boards will not be able to handle the problem alone. One way the public schools can score a few victories is to learn from the non-public schools. Some of what is needed can be gleaned by reading James Coleman's recently published study comparing public and private high schools. Coleman found that students in Catholic high schools, as compared with those in public high schools, do more homework, are less frequently absent, and enroll in more rigorous courses. Public schools can learn from that. They don't have the luxury of choosing and getting rid of students the way the non-public schools do, but there's still much they can do to emulate those schools. Educators in many places have decided it's time to expect more of students and to hold them to higher standards. It's what the public wants, and it's what the schools have a right to do. Terrell Bell, the Secretary of Education, says that, quote, educators, parents, and students have rediscovered an old truth, that higher expectations bring better results. Indeed, there are signs of both higher expectations and higher achievement. Believe it or not, after the disasters of the 1970s, standardized test scores in some big cities are actually rising. New York City and Pittsburgh now in the elementary grades in the and junior high school are above the national norm. The National Assessment of Educational Progress tells us that black children in the lower elementary grades made great strides during the last decade, though they still trail the white students, and that the billions of dollars spent on compensatory education have apparently made a difference. Even scores on the SAT tests have started going up after 19 years of not improving. All of the wounds are not healed, though. For instance, students still have abominable habits when it comes to writing, and those of us who take seriously the matter of putting words on paper cannot help but be alarmed by what we read. There's come of age a generation for whom the printed word is akin to hieroglyphics. I think it's best summed up in a manual that was produced for freshmen at Stanford University, which is no slouch of an institution, a writing manual for the students there. And what it says is, many students talk and act as if good writing were a rare imaginary creature, like the griffin or the unicorn. Even as they set out after it, they hardly believe in its existence, and certainly not in their ability to track it to its hiding place. How interesting it is that the computer age has dawned in all its technological brilliance, and so many people implore the schools to make certain that nobody attains a high school diploma without computer literacy. It's a wonderful goal. But where are the voices for other kinds of literacy? Who's urging that all high school graduates be exposed to the master writers? Why is it acceptable for young people to complete the 12th grade without having ever been exposed to any of the Americans who have won the Nobel Prize for Literature? And you'd better believe that tens of thousands of people come out of high schools in that condition. This is what has happened in an era during which the stress has been on quantity, not quality. The nation set the diploma as a goal for all, a wonderful goal. But why did educational content have to be watered down to make this goal desirable? The diploma has become a confusing and sometimes meaningless symbol. Willard McGuire, the president of the National Education Association, says that fewer students are taking fewer courses and spending fewer hours studying math and science, foreign languages, and communication skills. He went on to describe the results of a federal government survey that found that only 1/3 of graduating seniors had taken at least 3 years of math. The young people for whom the system is failing most miserably are disproportionately those from minority groups. They are the ones who end up in welfare lines and fill prison cells and hang out on street corners with no skills to sell in an employment market that has little time for compassion. Without a doubt, the biggest challenge facing American schools is the need, the imperative, if you will, to ameliorate this festering situation. Kenneth Clark, the psychologist, was the subject of a profile in the New Yorker magazine not long ago. His testimony was important in the Brown decision in 1954. And he observed, quote, "In the schools, although scores are going up in some places, more black kids are being put on the dung heap every year." Now, it's true that the life of these children during the years before they enter school, even before they leave the womb, help shape this disaster. In many cases, once they're in school, life in their homes and among their peers is in no way supportive of what happens in the classroom. Nonetheless, it's up to the schools to make a difference in their lives. The success of public education will be gauged by its ability to help snatch the minority children of this country from the jaws of despair. There is no other mechanism to accomplish it, only the public schools. You'd better believe that the private schools are not taking this on. Failure on a massive scale has existed for all too long for minority pupils. If the schools do not solve this problem, educators may as well forget about everything else, because the social structure of the country will not be strong enough to bear the results of such failure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maeroff. Today at the City Club, we're listening to Gene Maeroff of the New York Times speak on public education. Where is it going? In just a minute, we'll turn to our question period, but first, a few announcements. As you know by now, we are enjoying temporary quarters here in the Hollenden House, but we're looking forward to our permanent move to our new location in the Citizens Building later this year. Because of this and the interest and the excitement it expresses, our current membership campaign has adopted the slogan City Club 82 on the move. This is our way of saying now is the time to join the City Club. We were founded in 1912, 70 years ago, but as we see it now, our future is really ahead of us. If you're not now a member, please give us a call at 621-0082. We'll send you all the information you need about joining. 621-0082, the City Club. We want you to join, especially now during October, our special membership month. Today, as always, we have with us students from area high schools who are participating with us in our Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Public Schools and Cuyahoga Community College. With us now are students from the following high schools: Lincoln West, Glenville, South, Olmsted Falls, Warrensville, Benedictine, Normandy, Mayfield, and Cleveland Heights. Would they please stand to receive our welcome? Thank you. They'll be meeting with Mr. Maeroff right after our forum here for their own seminar. We're pleased also to have with us today as guests those who are participating in the Cleveland State University 4th Annual Fall Conference, sponsored by its College of Urban Affairs and the College of Education. In addition, 3 guests are here at our head table and have been meeting with us: David Sweet, Dean of the College of Urban Affairs; John Flower, Provost and Vice President; and Dean Richard McCardle of the School of Education, all from Cleveland State, and we're very pleased to have you with us here today as well. Thank you. Next week, our forum program will feature the first of our traditional City Club debates prior to the November election. Next Friday, it's senatorial time. Our speakers will be candidates for the United States Senate: Howard Metzenbaum, Paul Pfeiffer, the other candidates for that position. Make your reservations early for this important debate. More importantly, on your way out, you can make a reservation as you leave the auditorium today to ensure yourself a place at what will, without doubt, be a sellout. Now for our questions for Mr. Maeroff. We have two microphones, Alan Davis in the front, Bob Conrad towards the rear. We'll start with our first question. Gene?
This is sort of an ancillary question dealing with the daily appearance in the papers of job openings which never seem to be filled. Is there anything that public education can do to prepare kids to fill those jobs?
Many of the jobs that are listed in the paper and go unfilled are jobs increasingly, almost entirely, that involve technical training. And indeed, education could make all the difference in letting those jobs be filled. There aren't enough people who have the technical training to be able to fill those jobs, and that's how simple it is. And somebody who's 48 years old and unskilled and out of work certainly isn't going to be hired as a person designing software for a computer company, but there are people who can be trained in the schools and the colleges to do those things.
You said that the schools cannot do all the things that the home and society do not want to do or can't do. In saving the minority children, can the schools do that alone? And what are the roles of the home and others?
Well, unfortunately, we're probably at the point where it's impossible for the schools to do the job alone. And some places they have found that the schools can provide more leadership in working with the home, a lot more than they have. There was, I write about this in my book, there was a situation in Fowler, California, where the schools looked at kids from disadvantaged backgrounds and saw that some achieve very well coming from the same background ostensibly as others. And they went and they sent people into those homes to find out why, to analyze. And they looked in these homes and they found a few key things so they could try to analyze it. And they found that there was always some adult. It might not be a mother, it might not be a father, it might be another relative, it might be an older sibling who took an interest in that youngster. And there was always interest to make sure that that young person had a place to study. In some of those places it meant making sure nobody else in the family could use the bathroom for an hour, setting aside the bathroom if that was the only place that studying would be possible. Then they brought in other parents and they tried to let them understand what's been happening in some other homes. These are small projects, but it's true that the schools are probably going to have to take on some of these responsibilities, as difficult as it may be, because if they're not happening in the home, I don't know where they're going to happen, and other social agencies apparently don't have the money or aren't stepping in to do it.
Mr. Maeroff, I'm afraid I might be accused of being subversive. Last week, when the environmentalist from Canada was here, I asked him a question, and he admitted that the Soviet Union was doing more for the environment than the United States. I've read recently that the Soviet Union is turning out 4 times as many mathematicians and engineers as we are here. As Khrushchev said, we'll bury you. Was that what he had in mind?
Well, it might be a part of it, and that's part of the shovel, I guess. You could throw in Japan in that, too, because per capita basis, Japan does not have as large a population as the United States, but turns out many more engineers. And there's a lot more that happens, apparently, in the early years of education in those countries than happens here to make sure that students are ready for this more intense work by the time they get to high school and college. From what I've seen as a person who's a professional observer of education, the whole ball game gets won or lost by about the 3rd or 4th grade. And if the schools aren't willing to really put the resources down there in the lower grades and to do everything they can to make sure the proper foundation is put in place, then the students get up to high school. They can't take math because they don't have the background. The high schools aren't involved in all that much remediation. And so what happens in the system that you're talking about is probably the result of a much more intense early education than we have in this country. I've never looked at the Soviet education system, but from what I've read about it, that's what I would glean.
Yes, sir. You talked about the number of older people compared to the number of children. Is there anything that you know of being done to bring these older people in to help tutor the kids, a kind of a domestic Peace Corps for the schools?
Well, there's a little bit of that going on. The percentage now is that 28% of all adults are connected with the public schools by having a child there. Not too many years ago was more like about 39%. And there are things happening, such as you indicate, of having older people come in and be tutors, having grandparents who aren't grandparents to those kids come in and talk to them about their lives. In Columbus, there was a program where they got 30,000 people to visit the schools who don't have children there. It's probably basically a PR gimmick, but they got them into the schools. Most people don't get into the schools if they don't have children there. Then depends on what the next step is. But it's a valuable resource, as you say, and it's not being tapped as much as it can. One of the obstacles, I guess, an obstacle in a lot of things becomes sometimes teachers in that, and you could see it from their point of view, they don't want people giving away something that they get paid to do, because then they say not as many teachers get hired. It's true. I don't know how you deal with that dilemma.
Do you feel that local governance and local financing of our public school systems is going to be a viable way of meeting the challenges you hold out for the schools?
Well, right now, the local financing, which exists all across the country, not just in Ohio, but everywhere, is based on property wealth. And if somebody is lucky enough to live in a place that has a huge, in this case, a huge CEI plant, which pays a lot of taxes, then the other people there don't have to pay as much tax. There's more money available. It's a totally inequitable system, both to the taxpayers and to the children, because where where a child's parents happen to live determines the amount of local money that's going to be available. It'd be far fairer to just have a uniform rate of property tax, as there is in the state of Hawaii, and have it all go into a central place and then all be doled back out of a general fund and all. But the haves will not permit that to happen. The have-nots want it, but the haves won't. Just recently in New York State, the highest court overturned a decision that would have called for school finance reform there.
Would you care to clarify a contradiction in your address? You said public schools should learn from non-public schools. On the other hand, previously in your address, you criticized the attempt to give tax credit for tuition to support the non-public schools.
Well, I don't see that as a contradiction. Non-public schools have every right to exist, and Louis Marshall argued a case up to the Supreme Court involving Catholic schools in Oregon that has established their right to exist in the early part of this century. And if people are willing to pay for those schools, Catholic, non-Catholic, private schools, any kind, then they can use them. My position is, as an advocate of public education, that this should not be paid for. They get a lot of public money as it is anyway. They participate in Title I and other programs. But I don't think that the federal government should be doing something to help further finance non-public education. On the other hand, we have to recognize that many non-public schools are doing a very good job. And it's worth looking at them, as James Coleman did, to try to find out what might be going on there that public schools can copy. One of the things, if we know that when students behave, when there's order in a school, there's got to be more teaching and learning. Oh, what kinds of things do they do in the non-public schools to bring that about? What do they do to get their students to do more homework? I visited a Catholic school in elementary school in Harlem last year, and it was right across the street from a public school with abominable achievement scores. And these were all black kids in the Catholic school, and they were achieving, kids from very similar kinds of background. Well, what was going on in that school? It's not just class size, because The nuns and the lay teacher in that school had up to 40 kids in a class. It's not simply class size. There's something else that goes on. We have to realize that the motivation in a family that causes them to use a non-public school says something about the family, even if all the other socioeconomic, demographic statistics indicate they're the same. This school was so favored by these people that when they were moving far out of the neighborhood, they kept sending their children back into it to use it. So that's what I don't see it as a contradiction for that reason.
Yes. When you said that more involvement from the parents should be offered to the public schools, what would happen if there are organizations of retired teachers trying to get involved with parents to start a tutoring program, yet you can't motivate the parents enough to get their children out? Yet you're, as senior citizens and as retired teachers, we are willing to help, but we can't get the parents.
The parents won't produce the children?
Won't produce the children.
I don't know. That's a problem. It's definitely a problem. You know, there's a two-sided sword here when it comes to parents and schools. On the one hand, public schools have generally been rather resistant to letting parents get involved in a meaningful way. I'm not talking about pouring tea and serving cookies. I'm talking about having a meaningful role. The public schools have been very, very resistant. On the other hand, in many cases where this has been offered, as this lady says, the parents have been reluctant to participate. I mention in my book the president of the National Association of Secondary School Principals, who's a principal of a high school in Georgia, and he tells of an open school night in which the parents of 12 children showed up. And that's not an inner city school either.
You commented a moment ago upon real estate taxes being the base for revenues for the school systems. In view of the increasing disparity between the urban areas and the suburbs, can you suggest any possible recommendation for a national policy which might assist in leveling out the dollars available for public education? If so, do you see any possible hopes for it succeeding?
Do you have something in mind as a national policy?
I'm asking you.
I don't think that first of all, education is not mentioned as a function in the United States Constitution. You could search the whole document. You will not see mention of education. I don't think that the federal government can be counted on to do anything in regard to those inequities. The federal contribution to the schools has averaged about 8%, 9% in recent years. And now, as a matter of fact, as you know, President Reagan has decided to push that down a bit. And if anything, he would even like to phase a lot of it all the way out. So that's not likely to happen. I think even if there'd be another administration that would be more sympathetic to public education and such things, that would not be the avenue, because I just don't think the federal government could be counted on. And there's no way that the federal government, that Congress, can do anything to compel the states to make changes in their funding. So really it has to come state by state, and it's up to the states to decide. There's nothing wrong with having a tax on property, on real estate. But the idea is if there would be a uniform real estate tax so that this community, if you live in this community as things now stand, you might pay a tax 3 times higher than somebody who lives in this community, which has much more property wealth, and yet still not produce as much money for the schools. It has to come at the state level. It's the only way it's going to happen. It's going to happen in the state capitals, or it's not going to happen at all.
How do you feel that Cleveland stacks up nationally with our school system?
Well, it's not. I think it's only fair to compare it with the other big city school systems, and it's not in the first rank.
Is education not too serious to be governed by boards of education, and is there not a better way?
I think that there might be a better way. I think that schools could run very well without boards of education, frankly, in most places. Now, I'm just not talking just about Cleveland. I'm talking generally. I think that in New York and most places. But one of the problems I have with that is that I believe very strongly that the public has a right to say something about the schools and to have input and determine policies And if they don't, that's not good. So I'm not sure how to reconcile that. But in terms of just a school system running, I think school systems could run fine without boards of education. But the problem is the input of the public, and maybe some other design could be established to assure that.
In your address, you mentioned the third grade as being some sort of watershed for victory or defeat in the math and sciences. Eventually, if the educational system recognizes that, what do you think they're going to have to do to that they're not doing now to make a kid into a mathematician or a scientist or a writer of English?
Well, you have to have teachers who aren't afraid of math and who know science. And frankly, most teachers in elementary schools aren't very different from you and I. And in most cases, you and I means that we're not math wizards. Most people aren't math wizards. And so I wrote in my book about a school system that was using math specialists. Rather, you know, gym and art are considered important enough in elementary schools to turn over to specialists. I don't really know why math couldn't be. The problem is to find the people to teach it. And I have a lot of sense of despair about that because I don't know where they're going to come from. People are not going to give up jobs with IBM generally to come take about a third of the pay to teach math to third graders. So I don't know what we're going to do. I think it's really a desperate situation because if you look at the public schools all around the country now, increasingly above the elementary school where you have regular math courses, increasingly those courses are being taught by people who did not have specific preparation in math. So if we had a problem before, imagine what it's going to be 15 years from now. And I don't know where they're going to get money to get people to teach math and science. I really don't.
We speak a little peculiarly of research findings that show that children differ in their approach to reading. And yet it's a very critical item. And I want to know in this time of hard-pressed dollars what the Cleveland public schools and other public school systems can do to individualize their teaching to account for that kind of a report.
They could have reading specialists. They could make sure that more children have the time for small group and individual instruction. From the research I've seen, they don't have to be wedded to any one particular way of teaching reading, since children learn in different kinds of ways, but they could get support out of the home wherever possible and start very early. Start very early. You know, there was a feeling that you shouldn't some people felt you shouldn't do anything about reading too early. And in the state of New Jersey, until not too long ago, they had a law. There was actually a law that you could not teach reading in the kindergarten. And they went through the schools and removed the tiles with the ABCs on them. Well, they've now changed that, so they're allowed to get into reading readiness now in kindergartens in New Jersey. But the idea is individual attention, smaller classes.
The theme of our CSU conference has been meeting the high technology challenge, school, business, and community partnerships. As you look across the country and address the issue of this math and science deficiency, have you seen any unique partnerships like we've been showcasing that have been developed here in Cleveland, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, other places, that deal with that specific issue and are bringing business executives or instructors into the primary and secondary schools to transfer some of that technical knowledge?
Well, it's all at an incipient stage, and what you're describing is something that more and more school systems are taking cognizance of and trying to work with business and industry, which do have the expertise, which also have the bread, and trying to do something to deal with that problem. I think a lot of corporations are getting sick and tired of having people come to them for jobs right out of school and not be able to have the entry-level skills. And they figure, well, it's in their advantage to get involved early in the process just for selfish reasons, which has a public benefit, of course.
I'd like to simply respond to the two people who asked about the role of the volunteer in the schools, particularly the retired person, and say that there are, at the moment, 6 million volunteers in the schools. And I would encourage anybody who has an interest in this to contact the nearest school system. The programs do exist. They aren't all widely publicized, but I think if you get in touch with your school system and say you're interested, someone will find a spot for your talents. And then I did have a question, too. I just wonder if you don't think one of our problems with the public schools is the difference in expectations between the generations of parents that preceded, particularly the children of the immigrants who were told that they had to get an education to earn their part of the American dream, as opposed to the children today who were raised with a lot of material things and who were told that they are entitled to the American dream.
Well, it isn't even a matter of whether, sociologically, of whether they were raised with a lot of material things. Any child growing up in American society today is subject to a whole barrage of influences that can't help but make him or her oriented toward instant gratification. You can't teach multiplication tables to people who are into instant gratification. And that's that.
Mr. Maeroff, we've heard a lot in the last few years of back to basics, back to the 3 R's, no frills education. From your, if you wish to call it, national viewpoint, how far has that proceeded? How pervasive is that? And how realistic in terms of, are they really doing it? Are they, and how much are they really throwing out the baby with the bathwater and so doing it?
Well, I think more of it's happening. There was a kind of basics that some people were preaching, and maybe still are, that's a sort of know-nothing basics, similar to the know-nothing political people back in the 19th century. And they would get rid of art and music and probably social studies, maybe even science, and just back to basics. Of course, that also means to them you could save money, too. But a more meaningful kind of back to basics that really takes note of the fact that kids have to learn to read and write in the early grades and puts a lot of stress on that is taking place in the big cities now and other school systems. And I think in a few years we'll know whether or not it's going to bear fruit. There are some signs that it is. I frankly think that the worst has bottomed out in big city school systems.
In 2 weeks, the City Club will have the candidates for Ohio governor in debate here. You're welcome to be here that day, but if you're not, what questions would you like to see them asked?
Well, a gentleman raised a question before about school finance. I would find out whether or not any of those candidates are willing to go on record to work vigorously for a system of financing schools that's totally fair to children and to taxpayers. There's a lot of room for improvement. When the Ohio Supreme Court ruled on that in a case out of Cincinnati, it turned it down and said the system as it now exists is legal. There's nothing illegal about the system. It just happens to be unfair.
Speaking of volunteers, I wonder how many of us here are familiar with the program that Steve Rose, a retired manufacturer, started in Cleveland called VIP, in which many volunteers from industry and so forth help tutor these children, help train them how to apply for a job, and give them actual contact with jobs, how things are happening in different factories and offices.
Well, that sounds like a marvelous approach.
Assuming that we can't get rid of school boards overnight the way you suggested, in certain areas, school boards, I believe, are appointed by the mayor, the so-called strong mayor system. Do you feel that has any possibilities for the rest of the country?
You know, there are places where there are appointed school boards that work very well, and there are places where there are elected school boards that work very well. And I'm not sure the issue of whether or not they're appointed or elected is crucial, because either one could work very well or work very poorly. So it's really a question of whether or not the people who have the most to offer are going to be willing to be on school boards in the first place, and then whether, if they're appointed, whether those who do the appointing are willing to appoint them or those who do the electing are willing to elect them. But when the election of school board members drops to the nadir, like electing judges, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it?
Yeah, Mr. Maeroff, Bruno Bettelheim and Paul Copperman contend that the primers written for early grade children and all the elementary school texts are usually about 2 years behind the grade level, and that the vocabulary of primers is about 1/10 what it was even in the 1920s. Do you know anything about that, or could you speak to that? That the textbooks are written at a grade level 2 or 3 levels beneath the grade.
Well, teachers don't have to use textbooks to teach reading, and they can use literature. There's nothing great about textbooks. They don't have to use textbooks to teach anything. And they can use literature. They're not obligated to use textbooks. It's true that textbooks have a lot of problems with them. And often with textbooks, because they're subjected to these readability formulas, they recast things that were written for adults. They take out all the connectors, no more ands. They stick in periods wherever they can to get shorter sentences, make shorter words because it'll meet the readability formula. But then it doesn't make any sense to kids, just like it wouldn't make any sense to adults.
Returning to the problems of school boards, your experience in New York City with decentralized school districts a number of years back, that would be one step in going closer to the people, and the other would be the traditional school board of Cleveland, and another would be doing without school boards. And the conflict that seemed to arise there was between the professional educators who were trained and felt they know what should be taught, and then the very responsive opinion of the parents as to what they would like to have taught. And would you comment on the experiences of that effort in New York City?
Well, very briefly, I think we're almost running out of time. New York decentralized into 32 community school districts. I don't think ultimately it made all that much difference one way or the other, whether there was a central board of education or the 32, because I don't think it produced that much input from parents and citizens that couldn't have existed even with a central board. So even what I said before about how you choose your school boards, I don't think decentralizing itself makes all that much difference either. It's not a panacea.
Mr. Maeroff, thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Our City Club Forum is adjourned.